Everybody, welcome to week 7, the penultimate week of the course. There's a lot going on, particularly around the final paper and then the final exam for next week. One of the things I did want to stress a little bit, though, is I actually did want to take some time and do a little bit more like a conventional screencast that I usually do in a class like this. Because I think what actually happened last week is we ended up sort of having an exchange on the discussion forum that was emblematic, I think, of what it is we're trying to accomplish in the classes, but also the kind of analytical approach that we're trying to develop the skills in order to conduct in relation to national security affairs, right? So I had some thoughts, right? So what did we learn last week? What's important to realize, and this is an important thing for the larger program, is the idea of security is actually a fairly nebulous concept. It's an incredibly powerful term. It's incredibly important. It finds its way into law, political debate, all kinds of things. But what it actually means to secure something is a little more nebulous, right? A really famous article goes so far as to saying it's an empty signifier. It doesn't really mean anything onto itself. It matters because it creates a way of looking at the world in a particular way. This is an important point that's brought up by Mary Kaldor in her book, which is a core reading of 515, which Marcy and Tasha have both read, and Claudia will be reading next term. And her argument is really premised on this idea that what it means to do security, to act in the name of security, is actually not something that's instrumentally available to us. Instead, it's something that's constructed. We think about the world in a particular way, and that leads us to think about securing it in very particular kinds of ways. This is precisely the kind of critique that MacDonald is after. He's arguing that if you frame climate change as a threat, what you actually have to do is frame it as a particular kind of threat, one to the state, one to human populations, right? One to institutional order in the international system. And when you do that, and he's saying that this is subtle, right? But it's essential. You do it whenever you call something a security threat. You are implicitly evoking a particular referent. So in his argument again, the international system, the state itself, groups of people, right? And when you do that, you predispose thinking about the problem through the lens of specific practices that you associate with that referent object, right? So when you think about if you construe climate change as a threat to the nation state, that means you bring on board things from national defense, which is militarization, conflict mitigation, investment, so on and so forth. The whole constellation here, right, of considerations is to get us to think about the fact that a lot of that happens implicitly. It happens because of the way we use language and we talk about something, but it has very important effects because it will predispose us to thinking about a problem in a particular way that may or may not be well suited to the problem. Now, you don't need a critical theorist to be a critical theorist for this to be important, right? You can be a more heterodox or sort of national security type that's just basically asking the reflexive question of, well, do the means that I associate with a particular threat actually line up with how I want to manage it, the end state? And actually, if you talk to anybody in national defense or the government about how to plan strategy, that is their definition of making strategy, specifying ends and then associating ways and means accounting for risk, right? So this is not just something that critical academics do. It is a reflexive process that's at the core of making strategy, right? And the strategic level is really what we're interested in a program like this. So what I wanted to point out is that this is not radically different, even though the content might look it, from the kinds of questions that Baldwin was asking about, right? He was asking about, well, how are you framing the question the right way in order for you to properly understand the relationship between the thing you want to secure or the thing you want to achieve and the means you've chosen to do it, right? I think it's also important to note that Blackwell and Harris were making the case for a specific narrative. And actually in the final week during that Zoom call, we did a really great job at unpacking about whether or not we actually thought their narrative lined up with the nature of the problem, right? What's interesting here is that when we talk about environment, and I think that's why environment is such an interesting thought experiment or domain to think about in a program like this is because it's really not settled. When we talk about economics, we talk about national defense, we talk about the homeland, we're talking about referent objects and narratives and associations that have become second nature, right? That we don't think about, that we're not necessarily all that cognizant about. But in terms of environmental security, we're actually in the process of constructing the referent object as a society, which means all these moving pieces are far more visible. All I wanted to do is stress that actually that's not unique to environmental politics. Actually, most academics would argue that this is true of all national security issues. It's just that those other national security issues do have settled narratives and ways of thinking, which we need to just be that much more aware of. So what is it we're arguing about, right? I thought that this was fantastic, and I'll just say again, I think that we did a really great job. By we, I mean the students and then me showing up for a few minutes. And last night's forum took on this great theme. I think that in both cases, we get at the core analytical question here. Notice that whether climate change exists or not was not really what the focus was. The debate was, well, if this is the environment in which we live, the debate was how best to respond. So what's the nature of the problem? And how do we align resources so that we're dealing with the precise nature of the problem? Note the need to talk about what is being secured, but how that, especially in Marcy's discussion, that builds out from there, right? Once we say that, well, actually what we need to do is secure the population, that's the nature of the state, that's so on and so forth, we can actually build out an argument for what we would ask the various apparatuses of the state to do, and then we can ascertain why it's not doing that and maybe work to address those obstacles, right? This is a version of the debate that IR theory has. So this is relating back to the Fit to 500. What IR theory is actually designed to do is not necessarily to tell you what to think about a particular issue, but instead to tell you how to think about it in very rigorous ways, what the nature of the problem is.